All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Kackner with the Fairfax County Department of Transportation, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting to discuss the update of the Fairfax County bicycle parking guidelines. Before we begin, I'd just like to review some of the guidelines so that everyone can participate and get the most out of this session. Just to note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube and then linked to the project webpage. Microsoft Teams also offers a live captioning service, and you can find that by clicking the three dots and choosing Turn on Live Captions. Once the presentation is completed, we will begin the question and answer portion, during which anyone will ask questions aloud. And you may also submit questions using the chat function at any time, and we'll do our best to answer all of those questions while also ensuring that we get to all participants. If you have multiple questions, this may mean you get placed back in the queue so that everyone has a chance to participate. And if you're on the phone, please just go ahead and hold your questions until the end, and we'll have instructions on how to ask those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. And we also encourage you to submit comments to today's meeting using the online survey feedback form or a phone call. And again, we'll have addresses for you at the end of this presentation. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Nicole Winans. And Nicole is the Active Transportation Project Manager at the Fairfax County Department of Transportation.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, everyone who is joining us today for an update on the Fairfax County bicycle parking guidelines effort. So the meeting agenda for today is that we're first going to go over, why is bike parking needed and what is bicycle parking, to provide some background information on this effort. We have current bicycle parking guidelines that we will quickly review, and new bicycle parking requirements. Then we will talk about why additional guidance is still needed and what those particular guidance will be in the updated bicycle parking guidelines. And then we will conclude the presentation today with next steps and a question and answer session. So let's take a look at why is bicycle parking needed. So bike parking is an essential part of owning a bicycle. It has to be stored somewhere, either at home or at your destination. That could be at work, at school, or park. Most daily destinations can be accessed by bicycle if they're not too far away, or people may choose to bike to transit and continue their commute from there, or just ride for fun. So it's not all about commuting. It's also a lot of Fairfax County residents like to bicycle through our parks, and we have an extensive trail system, many bike lanes. So there are many opportunities to either bike straight from home or put the bike on a bus or your private vehicle to get to your destination where you can ride from there. So we have many destination trails like the Mount Vernon Trail and the WOD Trail that people come to bike along and enjoy those facilities. But if you don't have a safe place to park your bike at home, you're less likely to be able to own a bike, particularly if you're in an apartment building, you may not have the space. If you're in a single family home, you often have a garage. And then on the flip side, if you're trying to get to the grocery store or your house of worship or a park and you have no place to safely keep your bike there, it may be a barrier. You may think twice about taking your bike, especially if it's more expensive, or you really want to make sure that nobody takes your bike and it's secure while you're away. Also, if no dedicated and adequate bike parking is provided, people may choose to park the bike wherever they can. So that could be a tree or fencing, railing, and as you see in the picture here, and it can potentially block access or damage either the landscaping or the railing or fencing that the bike is locked against. So that's not desirable. The bike can actually get damaged as well. It may be easier to steal the bike, so it could attract bike theft, knowing that there's not many secure bike facilities and easy targets. So those are a couple of the reasons why bike parking is definitely good to provide wherever people live and would want to go. So there's different types of bike parking that can be provided. And we usually differentiate between short-term bike parking and long-term bike parking. So the short-term bike parking is primarily serving those short trips, convenient stays, so near an entrance to a retail shop, for example, or if you're visiting a business or someone in an apartment building, when you arrive, you want to have your bike in a convenient location, securely locked, ideally not out of the way. So it's easy to see that the bike parking is available to you as a visitor of that facility. And then we have long-term parking, which is targeting people that stay for longer period of time in this location, either because they live there or because they work there or take transit, for example. So would like to store their bicycle at a transit station and continue their trip to where they need to go and know that it's in a secure location. So those bike racks are usually covered and also secure. There's an extra layer of security. It's usually an access controlled facility, either a bike room inside the building, a bike cage that is a freestanding building that is also access controlled, or those individual bike lockers, which are basically a mini bike parking garage that you can rent or have access to through your through the building management. So the current bicycle parking guidelines that the County Board of Supervisors endorsed in 2017 cover a lot of the principles that make for good bike parking. And that includes, the type of racks that are desirable. It covers the short-term and long-term bike parking design requirements. So as I mentioned, the short-term visitor parking is usually just bike racks that are near the entrance. So, where should those be located? What should they look like? How far do they need to be spaced from each other and surrounding obstacles, that they don't block any sort of access routes or service routes. Should be lit, a lit location, should be easily visible, and ideally within a short distance of the entrance in order to be convenient and usable. It also talks about the layout of the long-term bike parking, how, what equipment is appropriate for a bike room, how a bike room could potentially be laid out to make sure that all the bike racks are usable. For example, if they're too close to the wall, the space may not be usable by bicycle because it's too narrow, for example. So provide some guidance on how far it needs to be spaced from vertical objects like a wall or a pillar or another bike rack in order to ensure that it's accessible by bicycle and a bicycle can safely be stored there. We also have new bicycle parking requirements, and those went into effect this year. So really hot off the press. This update came out of the Parking Reimagined effort that the county undertook over the past couple of years to amend the zoning ordinance, particularly with a focus on parking that included vehicle parking and bicycle parking. So for the first time, Fairfax County now has bicycle parking requirements. What was a guideline before, now it's required through the zoning ordinance. but it's a very high-level requirement. So it just talks about how many bike parking spaces should be provided based on the land use, as well as how much vehicular parking is provided. So it's determining the amount of bike parking that's required based on a percentage of the required vehicle parking by land use. And that changes actually by density. So the denser an area, the higher the percentage. It also talks about basic requirements for rec design and location. So why do we still need bicycle parking guidelines now that we have a zoning ordinance requirement? The 2017 bicycle parking guidelines are, because they have a lot of information in there, is now no longer aligned with the zoning ordinance. So for example, the number of bike parking spaces that are recommended don't match what's in the zoning ordinance. So that needs to be aligned. Also, a lot has changed since 2017 in bicycle parking best practices. So we want to make sure that while we're in the process of updating this guide anyway, to make sure that we follow best practices. And then the zoning ordinance doesn't really include a lot of detail on bike parking facility design. So it provides very high-level guidance, again, on the number of spaces, but it doesn't differentiate between short-term and long-term parking. So it just says you need this many spaces, but then doesn't provide guidance on where those spaces or what type of spaces those would be serving visitors and employers. And that has something to do with the Virginia code not providing the county with the ability to require it as part of a zoning ordinance. So this has to be provided in a separate guidance document. So let's take a look at these draft bicycle parking guidelines that is the subject of this presentation. So some examples of the content of the guidelines include these basic bicycle parking space design requirements. So an example here is, you can see in light blue in the graphic on the right, the size of the desirable bicycle parking space. And that is for standard bicycles, but also for larger bicycles like cargo bikes. So they sometimes need a little bit more space, or if you have a standard bike with an attachment, and it's recommended to include at least some of these larger spaces in order to accommodate those non-standard bicycles. The guides talk about acceptable rack types. We usually recommend the inverted U rack is what we call it, or a hoop rack. So those meet all the requirements. This is what you usually see throughout Fairfax County and at most public buildings. It's generally recognized as one of the most basic but secure bike parking racks, and they meet all the requirements in our zoning ordinance as well. Then the guide provides guidance on the short-term parking specifically. So the example you see here on the right is a graphic from the guide that shows how these bike racks should be spaced from different features of the built environment and the public realm, but also for private properties. And how far should you be spaced from a crosswalk curb ramp, for example, in order to not block access to that crosswalk? How far set back from the curb or from a utility pole, as well as building surfaces and landscaping. So it talks about specific locations, how far from the building entrance, for example, this parking should ideally be spaced and desirable access routes to the bike parking. For example, that it is accessible by a curb ramp and not, require people to lift their bikes up over a curb in order to get to the bike rack, or share, for example, a busy driveway with cars, so that there should be a safe route from the public space and the public road to the bike parking. Again, it talks about bike types, bike rack types and spacing, and provides additional equipment and design options. Also, some of our areas that are a little bit more urban in the county would be called the activity centers or special planning areas. That includes, for example, Tysons, Reston, Springfield, Endale, McLean. So those mixed or commercial centers sometimes have a specific type of bike rack that they recommend in order to have a branded bike rack within that urban area. So there's a reference in this guide to these other guiding documents that allows a developer or someone that's interested in purchasing a rack for their business or for their school to follow those guidance. It also provides some recommendations for markings. For example, if a business or a public agency would like to provide dedicated scooter parking, that's often not a bike rack, but markings on the street or on a parking space that say, this is dedicated scooter parking. There's some guidance on that, and as well as best practices in maintaining those racks so they're usable into the future. The guide also provides design guidance for the long-term bike parking. So that again includes facilities such as a bike room in a building, a bicycle cage, which is basically a bike shed that has a fence around it, or is access controlled in other ways, but freestanding, or bicycle lockers, which are again these smaller kind of bicycle parking garages that you see at metro stations and transit centers throughout the county. But those can also be used by private property owners to securely store their bicycles. So again, we talk about ideal location and access routes to those facilities, but also in addition e-charging capabilities. So we know that electric assist bicycles and also electric scooters and other electric micromobility devices are becoming more and more popular. And where do you charge those? If you can't detach the battery and bring it into your office space or apartment building, but you have to plug it in, it needs to have that ability. There needs to be an outlet available to do so. So there's some recommendations on how many and what type to provide to allow for the charging of electric micromobility vehicles. The guide also provides information on rack types for those interior spaces, the spacing of those racks and the room layout, what security recommendations maybe, so what kind of security systems may be recommended, such as a camera or for example, a lock at the entrance. But there are other additional security recommendations that can be provided. And then additional user amenities. So that could be a bench for someone to change their shoes before they go on their bike, or a place to store a lock, or bike fixed tools. That's something else that can be provided. So there are a couple of amenities we don't necessarily require, but recommend as, those are nice to have if you would like to go the extra mile for your residents, for example, or your employees. And then again, maintenance, of course, is an important topic to make sure that the room is well maintained, usable into the future. So here we have one of the key pieces of information that are not currently in the zoning ordinance, and this is, how much visitor parking do you need and how much secure parking do you need, and it really depends on your land use. It varies. So for a residential land use, for example, for example, multifamily dwelling, you would need more secure parking. For example, 80% of the recommended bike parking should be long-term. So people that live in that building have a place to store their bikes when they don't use it, but still provide 20% visitor parking for people that come and visit the residents in the apartment. And in contrast, going to the next one here, the commercial uses are basically the opposite. So they need more short-term parking because that the business model, maybe a restaurant or a shop, and people will come and stay for a shorter period of time. So 1 to 3 hours. So there's a greater need for that short-term parking, but you still need some long-term parking for the employees at those locations. And finally, the guide is providing some guidance on signage, so wayfinding signage to those, particularly the indoor facilities, but also the outdoor facilities. So if it's not clearly visible from the entrance to the property, it's helpful to guide cyclists to those facilities with either regular street signage, but as you can see on the right here, some people have gotten really creative and making it a feature of their parking facilities to help really draw attention to those facilities and elevate the space. So the next steps for this project is so this is a start basically of the public feedback period, and it will be open until April 2nd. So you can submit in your feedback in a variety of ways, which I will cover on the next slide. But you have until April 2nd to send us your feedback on the draft report, and we really appreciate your insights, especially if you're a regular user of these facilities. Are we really covering the needs that you experience? And then we are hoping to bring the final guide to the Board of Supervisors for endorsement at some point this summer of this year. So this concludes the presentation for today, and we're happy to take any questions. And this slide also shows the project website, the feedback form, and the contact information if you would like to provide feedback that Hannah will also cover in a second. Thank you.
So as Nicole mentioned, we will now move on to the question and answer portion of this presentation, and you may either ask your question verbally by raising your virtual hand, which is located at the top of your screen next to the 3 dots, and I will call on you and enable your microphone so that you can ask your question. So please unmute yourself when I call your name and ask your question or provide your comment. And then please mute yourself after you have asked your question. And if you're on the phone, you can press *5 to raise your hand. And when I call on you by your phone number, just press *6 to unmute. And once you finish asking your question or making your comment, just push *6 to mute yourself again. And you can also submit any questions into the chat, and we'll read your question out loud. Okay, so I think I saw Dawn has a hand up, so let me just unmute you, and I'll let you know as soon as you're given microphone access, so you can unmute. Sorry, there's a little bit of lag on my end, so just bear with me for a second. Okay. Okay. John, you should be able to unmute yourself. Not hearing anything. Are you, Nicole? I think you still need to hit unmute.
It has to be unmuted twice.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Well, the McLean Citizen Association asked me to be on this because I'm probably the only 70-year-old who's biking on the association. So I actually went ahead and read the bicycle parking guidelines. The one thing that struck me was there's no mention of enforcement. And this is kind of based on my experience. I take a lot of classes. I bike from McLean and I bike over to GMU in Arlington. And what I've noticed over the years, a lot of people like me have figured out biking is the way to get around Arlington, if you're inside the Beltway. The trouble is people also, same thought occurred to them. If you're biking regularly from, let's say from Falls Church to GMU, and they've got these outdoor racks, what people will do is they'll put a U-lock on and they leave it there. And essentially what that does, that makes that public space private because it's very hard to take off a U-lock. So the concern I have is how do you enforce these regulations? How do you ensure, at least in the public spaces, somebody doesn't leave a U-lock there? So that, if they leave in the evening, they just leave the U-lock there and then they come back in the morning and the U-lock's there. So they don't need to carry an extra 10, 15 pounds home. So that's one comment. So it's a little bit about enforcement, and I think that could become an issue. The other concern I have, at least when I read, the design guidelines, again, my experience at George Mason, they do have a parking garage and they do have a bike rack inside. So I found when I read the design, the bicycle parking guidelines, there's a little ambiguity about indoors and outdoors, about how to address that. So those are, but I think some buildings like George Mason University in Arlington does have a bike rack in the garage. It's not a U-lock. It's not to the store. But I thought there could be buildings that would have indoor locks, indoor places as well as outside. Those are my two comments.
Thank you so much. That's a great perspective to share, particularly those are actually common questions we get too. So it will definitely make sense to address those in the guide as well, just to make sure that is clear. So thank you for bringing that up. So the locks that are being left behind in the public space, it's really up to the agency that put those bike racks there to check that, locks that are basically abandoned and just stay there, that we cut them off in order to allow, parking at those locations, but also, that's part of the maintenance, that it's not cluttered and that it looks good and doesn't become, a blight for the community. So we have equipment that we can use to cut those locks off. They're very secure, but there's definitely equipment that can cover that. It may be a little bit more challenging for a private property owner, but even those have maintenance equipment that, if it becomes a problem, could be addressed. So for the indoor facilities, we recommend, as one of the amenities, as I mentioned, a bike lock storage. So we understand that it's definitely, a inconvenience for cyclists to carry a heavy lock with them, and providing a designated space that is not the rack, but a separate location to store your lock if you come daily and you just need that lock. You can just keep it there. So there's special lock holders for that situation, and it's definitely recommended to provide that. Not a requirement, but If you don't actually do that on a daily basis, you would maybe not think about it as the architect of the room to provide something like that. On the other question, that's a really good one because we get that a lot from developers. Like, I provide bike parking racks in my garage. Does that count towards long-term parking? And the answer is no, because it's covered short-term parking, but it's not secured. So we're looking for that extra layer of security. It needs to be access controlled. Even if the garage is access controlled, that's not enough to fulfill the requirement of an access controlled bike space, because it should only be accessed by users of the bike facility, not a general property, because some of these parking garages can be pretty big with, you know, hundreds of parking spaces in it, and it's still too public to be considered a secure bike facility. So thank you.
All right, next we will move on to Evan, and I'll let you know once I have your mic unmuted. Or sorry, allowed. You'll still have to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Evan Ramey. I'm currently a on-campus student at George Mason. And one thing about the campus is that we have very few people commuting here by bike, but there are a number of students who live on campus that bike between classes. And on Wilkins Plaza, the main pedestrian thoroughfare, I mean, there are like tens of thousands of students that have to get to class. There isn't enough space for everyone to bike there. And I'm kind of concerned that the 80% short-term rate for college and university would sort of encourage this behavior of biking between classes, rather than, you know, if we're closer to an office space where it's 20 short-term, 80 long-term, that would actually encourage people to bike to campus and then walk around once we're here. Like the campus should be a park once kind of area for bikes or for cars, just because there's no way to move that many people in 10 minutes, you know, without just using your feet. So I think that colleges should be more primarily long-term storage, because it should be treated like an office. That's all I
Great,
got.
thank you for your comment. And do you feel that's specifically for GMU, or for in general for colleges they should provide? And as a student, that's actually an interesting question to ask, and I'm glad you're calling. Would you think that students are going to use the long-term parking, or would it maybe be seen as an inconvenience if you're just trying to get places really quick? And so that's one thing we thought of for the regular schools, the public K-12 schools, is that students will probably not likely use those long-term facilities that would serve teachers more, or students with more expensive bikes, or, you know, students that would like to charge the micromobility vehicles. Because the location of the secure facilities are often not quite as convenient as the short-term. So how much does the convenience factor play a role in the decision-making of which facility to use? If you have more insights on that.
So I think you're probably spot on with K-12. Like, I did bike a lot to my elementary school, and I wouldn't have wanted to like swipe into a weird like bike room and then have to lock up in there and have to walk out. So for K-12, I think that's absolutely accurate. But I have noticed that there's one particular bike rack on campus that's right next to Wilkins Plaza. It's somewhat covered by a building, and there's a lot of foot traffic in the area. And that bike rack is the only place that I've seen lobster mitts on the bike, because that means that's someone who's actually bike commuting. They're serious about incorporating it into the routine. It's not just someone who thought, oh, well, I'll grab a Walmart bike and then they slot it by their dorm room. That's someone who's actually using it, that's replacing car trips or transit trips, or just making it a lot quicker to walk. Like, actual bike commuters will use that one in particular. There's definitely latent demand for long-term secure bike storage, especially at residence halls. I think those are considered 80-20 anyway. But I mean, me personally, I'm currently keeping my bike inside of my dorm because there just is not enough room on the racks outside, nor would I want to keep it outside most of the time. And most of the people that commute here by bike will end up leaving their bike the whole day. They'll just find a club to join if they have some space between classes. So it's not necessarily that people will or probably should, bike to this first class and then bike to their next class and then bike to home and then their fourth class. It's more, I think for colleges, it should be treated more like car parking, where it's you bike here, do your things, bike home. And there should be like short-term spots in general, like if someone just has to stop by for like a library book. But I think in general, colleges really should be more closer to an office building than an elementary school.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that information.
Yeah, thank you. And just a reminder, once you've asked your question, just go ahead and lower your hand. Next, we'll move to Bruce. I'll let you know once I have your microphone enabled. All right, Bruce, your microphone is enabled. You're still muted on our end if you're trying to speak. Oh, it says that your microphone is enabled. It's not letting you just hit the mic button at the top of the screen. Okay. I'll try moving on to Andy and then coming back to you. And then if that doesn't work, maybe you could try the chat, but it says that your microphone is enabled on my end. All right, we'll move on to Andy for now then. I've just given you microphone access.
Hello, thank you for the presentation and your all's efforts on this parking presentation. My question was around not bike parking infrastructure, but more like the actual biking infrastructure to get to place. I think concern, especially in Fairfax County, is how car-centric everything is. And having, all these taxpayer dollars being put into parking might not be well worth the investment if there is no safe infrastructure for people to bike. I'm sure many might agree that, paint on the side of the road is not infrastructure. Cars feel entitled. There's aggression and abuse by motorists that really can have an impact on the number of people cycling. So my question really is this: is there any kind of like plan to renovate the roads or create segregated cycle routes that are safe and bike friendly in conjunction with where these proposed bike parking lots would be? Because I think if there isn't that safe infrastructure, a lot of these bike parking places might just sit empty or well below capacity.
Thank you, and that's a really great question. So it's a multi-pronged approach. So we, within especially, FCDOT, but also the Virginia Department of Transportation, the Fairfax County Park Authority, and private developers, when they come in with their proposals, we all work together to improve bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure throughout the county. Unfortunately, it's an older county. We were mostly developed during a time when bicycle parking facilities were not really a thing. So it wasn't part of any requirements. There was no public demand for it. So unfortunately, we are now in the situation where we have to retrofit hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles of roads with bicycle infrastructure, but also sometimes pedestrian infrastructure. There's still a lot of roads that have unfortunately no active transportation facilities. But the newer areas, particularly in the Chantilly and the Sully area that were more recently developed, or the Herndon Innovation area, so where newer roads were built and more development is happening, we see more infrastructure that's more bike friendly and more walkable. And a lot of the shared use path that you see on the side of the road, so it's basically where instead of a concrete sidewalk, you have a paved trail. Those are actual bicycle facilities that are specifically designed for a shared use by bikes and pedestrians. We have over 550 miles of those trails throughout the county. They don't go everywhere. They're not connected everywhere, but there's definitely some facilities there that form a bit of a backbone. But then, of course, especially some of the older neighborhoods near Arlington, Alexandria, there's fewer trails there, so there are more retrofit needed. The county is working on that, one gap at a time. It's very expensive to build those facilities, particularly if it's a new trail or sidewalk. They're definitely run in the millions. So funding is limited. We recently went through an effort to identify some of the most critical gaps, and we had about 2,800 gaps to look through to identify which ones were high priority. We are, though, in a situation where we have a lot of access pavement. So we work with the Virginia Department of Transportation as part of their annual repaving program to add bike lanes where we can. So a lot of the bike lanes you see throughout Fairfax County are added through that annual paving. And that's a really good partnership with the state on quickly adding facilities at very low cost. They're not 100% connected, and they're sometimes don't go through intersections, but it's definitely improvement for cyclists, but also it makes the road safer for drivers and pedestrians as well. So that's an approach we're taking. And then the bike parking, if the building goes up and it doesn't have bike parking, there's no process for it to be added later unless the property owner feels like doing so later. So that's another issue, that we have older developments, especially shopping centers, that there were no bike parking guidelines in place. They're developed without bike parking guidelines. Now we have, people call us all the time asking like, how can we get bike parking at those shopping centers? And there's really no public process for that. So we want to make sure that all the new development that goes in actually has that bike parking provided. So we don't get into the situation when the demand is there, that there's no way to have bike parking provided unless the property owner feels like it. And that happens. And there are businesses and shopping centers that reach out to us and ask, we would like to add bike parking. Can you help us? And we are, of course, happy to do so. And those bike parking guidelines can be used for those facilities to make sure that the bike parking that it's invested in is also usable and convenient and serves its intended need. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
All right, we'll try moving on to Bruce again. If you could try unmuting yourself one more time.
Yeah, it looks like I can do that now. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right,
yep.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for this meeting and the opportunity to comment, and for the work that y'all are doing. Got a couple of quick comments. There is a bike room on county property at the Sharon Boulevard Community Health Center that is used as a storage area, which you pointed out on page 15 that they shouldn't be. And there's no way to park bikes in that bike room. There are some racks next to it, but I wanted to let you know about that. The multifamily parking requirements in the zoning ordinance are just grossly inadequate. I live in a condo with 35 units, and we would only be required to have 5 spaces, one of which if it's 10%, would well, half of one would be short-term parking. We've got right now a bike room with 17 racks, and we've got about 20 or more bikes in there. So I realize that that's kind of water under the dam, or over the dam, under the bridge, but it's going to be a problem. Hopefully you all can encourage them to do more. So a quick comment on the 10%, you might even go down as low as 5%. Not many people bike for short-term parking at these buildings. I think there's just a real need for long-term parking. If you go by almost any apartment building now, you'll see bikes parked on the balconies. I've got a couple others, but I'll just add one since there may be others who want to speak. On page 12 is the bike room for, I think, long-term parking. There's no mention of floor-mounted racks, and in my building, they are all wall-mounted, and so my wife's e-bike cannot be wall-mounted. So I would recommend something like 30% or some percentage be required to be floor mounted. E-bikes are more prominent. They're much heavier than regular bikes. And if I had time for others, I would go ahead, but I'll go ahead and let others speak if there are others waiting.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, so thank you for the feedback on the residential parking. So throughout this effort, we can't change what's in the zoning ordinance, but that is good to know for, the next time it gets updated, to take a look at the residential parking rates and the experience that residents have with the new rates that are now basically being implemented. So we get some real world experience, but to help with alleviate some of that pressure on the long-term facilities, to have more of them by going down to 5%. That's a good recommendation. Thank you for that. On the floor-mounted racks, it's actually all floor-mounted. So the zoning ordinance no longer permits these high-capacity racks that are wall-mounted. So it requires the need to hang a bike, or even the bike racks that are the double-decker bikes where you can store one bike on top of each other. So all the racks should be the inverted U racks or similar, even in the long-term storage. And that's due of how the zoning ordinance is phrased and the basic bike space requirements.
So that's called out specifically in the zoning ordinance.
It's called out specifically in the zoning ordinance, and it's also described in the guide that the high capacity racks are no longer acceptable because they're none on the market that would meet the requirements in the zoning ordinance. That may change in the future, but we're not aware of one that would. So for now, the recommendation is to just stick with the inverted U or similar for the long-term facilities. So it should address all your needs for the electric bikes and the non-standard bikes, and not being able to lift in.
Thank you. If I could add one more. On, let me see, page 8, slide 10, it shows only 1 foot of clearance on the rack into the active transportation zone, and it doesn't seem like that's enough. And so I'm wondering if that active transportation zone is meant to be an area where the bike could stick into it. Otherwise, I would recommend, it seems like 3 feet is the minimum that would be needed.
Right.
Can you go back to that?
Yes. Yeah, so, yeah, I can actually look at that to make sure.
Yeah, because it's both the top.
This is the one. Yes, no, you're correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should be 3 feet. It's 1 foot from the bike parking space, which includes the entire area where the bike is parked, not from the rack. So we will make that correction. Thank you for catching that.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we had a comment. I'm with the Fairfax Alliance for Better Bicycling, and someone commented that they would love to have security cameras at even the short-term parking. I was glad to see it's recommended for the long-term, but I mean, it would be nice, maybe it could be mentioned as a possibility for short-term.
Yeah, great comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great. Do we have any additional comments? Oh, I see one in the chat. Evan says, I worry that preventing high capacity racks may discourage developers from overbuilding bike parking due to the land required and inability to stack vertically. I think that they should not count for required spaces, but they should be encouraged. The more bikes, the better.
Yeah, so I should clarify that everything in the zoning code, the zoning ordinance and those guidelines are minimum requirements. We often see developers go beyond the minimum requirements because they know that there is a lot of demand for biking and bicycle parking on their properties, particularly if they're in the walkable, bikeable areas and near transit. So they are welcome to add even high capacity racks if they wanted to add just another option or to just provide more capacity. But the minimum requirement parking needs to meet all the guidelines. So they would need to provide the minimum number, and then anything beyond that, there's a lot more flexibility, and we often see that being implemented. Thank you.
Oh, and I missed this, but Evan also said you could allow a single bike to park in an automobile parking spot. This would encourage reuse of car parking space to bike parking, since bike parking is denser.
That would only work if there was a bike rack in the parking space, which would no longer be usable by a car, so it would no longer be a car parking space. So there's a so in order to meet the minimum zoning requirements to make this a legal spot. Of course, if you know, in an apartment building you don't have a bike, you don't have a car, and you want to park your bike in your designated car parking spot, you're free to do so. But you would probably need to bring your own bike rack in order to do so, unless you know, find another way to just have your bike, you know, held upright and locked somewhere. But it's not necessarily what we want to, you know, ask developers to do. But you know, it's your space. You may be able to use it in different ways. But it is possible if a developer is overparked, which means they provide more vehicular parking than they're required, to convert a car parking space to bike parking by adding racks formally into this car parking space. So one car, the area for one car usually fits a rack that would store up to 8 bicycles. So it's, if there's a lot of demand for bike parking, particularly, that's a good use of space. And it's definitely something we can do on county property. We cannot do that yet in VDOT right away. So we cannot convert a street parking space to bike parking yet. It's something we want to work on with VDOT in the future to get permits for those. Since we now have bike parking, a couple of bike share stations, which are the shared bicycles that the county owns, those can now be in on-street parking spaces. So potentially in the future, we will be able to provide bike parking that way, which would make it a lot more flexible for FCDOT to provide bike parking near where it's needed without impacting private property, and having the need to build very expensive concrete paths for the bike racks near the sidewalk or the shared use path. So that is just a flexible option that is definitely a good use of space.
And then it looks like Bruce has one additional comment. So you can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks. Regarding those parking spaces that are required by the county, I had suggested this during the Parking Reimagine. You know, the county could offer, you could have one less space if you turn that into 8, bike parking spaces. And so maybe in the future that could be something that could be done. You mentioned the idea of not being able to put bike parking in on private property, but some jurisdictions do have programs in which they encourage people and they actually provide funds for providing parking on private property. My wife and I today went to a building that was just recently renovated, and there is 0 parking in the parking garage or next to the building. And it seems like there could be a program with funds to do that. Do you think that's possible, Nicole?
So the county used to have a pilot program like that a couple of years ago, but it was discontinued. And our current approach is not to use taxpayer funds to improve private property, especially if it's something like a very low-cost bike rack. I mean, bike racks only cost a couple $100, and most property owners would probably be able to afford that. And we have such a huge need on public property still. So not all of our facilities have adequate bike parking. So we're probably, I mean, I can only throw a number out there, but it's probably over $100,000 worth of additional bike parking on public property that's needed, that we work towards before we use that funding, which would basically be competing funding to improve private property. So that's the main reason. But again, if you are able to provide a public rack near that shopping center or other property, that would be an okay use of those funds.
All right, thanks. I just agree with that philosophy, but I understand it. All right, thank you.
Okay, and the only other hand I'm seeing is John's. Did you have another comment, or was that from earlier? I can allow your mic just in case.
That was from earlier.
Okay, thank you.
I'm satisfied. Yeah, got good, very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so that will conclude the Q&A portion of this presentation. And as a reminder, feedback can be submitted until April 2nd, 2024 using the following channels. You can use public input at the link below, https://publicinput.com/w4357. You can also leave recorded comments at 703-890-5898 with the project code 6997. Or you can mail written comments to FCDOT attention, Nicole Winans, Active Transportation Section, 4050 Legato Road, Suite 400, 22033. For more information on this project or to review the draft Fairfax County bicycle parking guidelines, you can visit the project webpage at the following link, https://www.fairfaxcounty.gov/transportation/bike-walk/bicycle-parking-guidelines. So this concludes our meeting on the update of the Fairfax County bicycle parking guidelines. A recording of the meeting will be available on the project website in the next day or so. Thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your time and participation.
Thank you.